And now let me invite Dr. Silviu Petrovan, an expert in evidence-based conservation, to give us another keynote speech.
Good morning, bună dimineața. I'm Romanian, so yeah, great pleasure to be here. This is my 5th AINI conference. Yannick was saying that he's really frozen. I'm super sleep deprived. I woke up at 7, I realized it's 5 for me, British time, so if I sort of fade off a bit, bear with me. But yeah, I'm going to talk about evidence, and hopefully none of this will be particularly, I suppose, surprising or novel. But I'm also going to try and show some challenges, and I'm going to talk about the Conservation Evidence Project where I'm working at the University of Cambridge. So this was actually already mentioned in quite a few of the previous talks, but inherently environmental decisions are really complex, and this spans everything from infrastructure mitigation to threatened species management and international policies and agreements. So what are the things that we should try and consider in decision making? What are the elements? Andreas was already mentioning local knowledge and local context, including indigenous knowledge is very important, experiential knowledge in terms of implementation, expert opinion, legislation, social values, cultural values, economic costs. I actually have a big thing on economic costs, so I'm going to talk quite a bit about costs themselves, resources, and scientific evidence. But how well do we use the evidence? And this is something that I always mention to our students, the fact that actually when we really look at science being produced, as scientists, we mostly imagine that once we actually have published it, that's it, our job is done. But in reality, that's really not the case. A lot of the scientific evidence actually simply is ignored for a variety of reasons. And you can look at these numbers here, something like only a third or a quarter or even a tenth of the conservation applied management decisions are done with use of scientific evidence. So that's not great. So why would that be? I mean, it seems a bit counterintuitive. We always talk about the lack of evidence. So if evidence exists, why don't people use it? Well, there's a variety of reasons. Language problems, I'm going to mention something about that. The information might be too detailed. This is based on a paper from Fabian. This is Swiss practitioners, and it was published a couple of years ago. But lack of time and lack of access are really important factors. So if evidence exists and we don't use it, why is it important? And this is an example that we quite often give because it's a particular striking one. These are bat gantries that have been introduced to mitigate infrastructure, especially roads, basically not especially, but specifically road impacts on bats. And in Britain, there's a long history behind them, quite contentious and I suppose quite unpleasant. But long story short, actually, we have the evidence that they don't work. But even when that evidence existed, they still actually kept being introduced. And as you can see, actually generated some rather unpleasant headlines in the Daily Mail. But the complicating thing is that just years before, there was a newspaper article showing that they do work, the same structure. So how does this make any kind of sense? But when you look at it, this is a common problem. And I'm sure that as practitioners involved with road mitigation, this is something that we're all familiar with. Evidence is not equal, and evidence of use in the absence of a control can be really misleading. And this is a very good example. When surveys were carried out for these bat gantries, which were designed to provide a safe passage for the bats over the road, they were used by some bats. So they work, but of course they don't. Because when we actually look at the control, you can see the bat gantry there, and that's the usage by bats. You can see that the vast majority of the bats actually still cross the road through the unmitigated section. So this is a good example where evidence is really not equal. So what is evidence-based practice? This is something that actually if you speak to doctors or bodies, for instance, in Britain we have a body called NICE, NICE, in effect, actually look, it's an acronym, but in effect, they look at the evidence for a specific treatment, be that a drug or a type of surgery, and then they also look at the cost and the cost effectiveness, and they compare it. And then they say, okay, this is good, this is something that we're going to carry out. So inherently, it's where practitioners make decisions which are based on which are based on systematic and critical analysis of both their work and all the other work that exists. And this is in contrast with using, I suppose, your own experience or simply expert knowledge. But evidence is currently used to mean many different things. There's a really fantastic paper by Nick Solovsky, which was published last year. I really strongly suggest that you read it if you have time. It's very interesting. And also they talk about the fact that applying the standards from other disciplines, so as I mentioned, evidence-based practice was specifically done in the context of medicine. When you try to compare that with the data that we have available in conservation, it's shocking. The standards actually in medicine are randomized controlled trials, which, as we know, are very rarely the case in conservation. So there's work to do. But when you look at an evidence piece, we're doing quite a lot of work on this now. I'm not going to bore you too much with it, but I suppose in a simplistic manner, you can think of it as an evidence that has a degree of support. Does it work? And then you have weight. And the weight basically comes from two different elements. Is it reliable? And does it have relevance? Relevance being the specific relevance to your context. And you can also think of this in terms of a pyramid where you have studies at the base, systematic reviews, summaries, and decision support systems. And this is very much actually in line with what INI is doing, translating this body of evidence into guidance, ultimately to inform decision-making. And what we would really hope is that that decision-making will result in practitioner implementing it. They take the experience and then they feed back that into studies. But guidance is, we know it's critical. It's particularly critical for people working in mitigation because for many of them it's the law. For planning, actually, you have to show that you're following best guidance. But when we look, this is in the context of Britain, when we look at the planning guidance, we can see that a lot of it is outdated, in some cases by a lot, by 2 decades. And also the rate actually of producing guidance has declined in some cases. And this is down to, I suppose, political appetite for it. Worse still, we can see that when you look at the guidance and what do they refer to and what they cite, a lot of it is actually circular. And why is this problematic? It's because it becomes impossible actually to trace the source information. So somebody says something in a guidance document and you think, oh, okay, yeah, there must be a study, and you try and actually follow that data through, and you find a different guidance document actually, which still doesn't include the primary data. So all those nodes that you see there are guidance documents that are cited by other guidance documents. And it becomes really intransparent. Also, guidance can have really low local relevance. And I think it's particularly important to consider this in the context of global information. We're very lucky in Europe because Europe actually is a powerhouse for science, just as the US is. And as you can see, South Africa and Australia, we produce a lot of science that is relevant. This is for terrestrial mammals, by the way. It's a paper that we have in work. But when you look at where this evidence is produced, you can see that actually the distribution is extraordinarily biased towards some countries. So keep that in mind, actually. Just because we produce science, it doesn't mean that it has local relevance in other places. And this becomes even worse when you look at robust study designs. Keep in mind what I said at the beginning about the standards in medicine. We have there before and after, BACI studies, controlled impact, randomized control studies. And you can see that the distribution actually becomes narrower and narrower as we actually increase the study design, I suppose, viability. So that was for terrestrial mammals. You can see actually this was a paper that we published a couple of years ago. And this is for amphibians and birds, and you have almost exactly the same picture. Study design tends to become weaker as soon as we move out, I suppose, from Europe, Western Europe especially, and North America. Biases are also very heavily taxonomically biased. Some of you might be working on primates. We produced a big paper a couple of years ago looking at the conservation evidence data for actions to do with primates. And you can see some groups actually in white. So for instance, tarsiers have 0 studies. That's despite the fact that actually they comprise a lot of species and some of them are almost certainly threatened. No studies whatsoever. And even for the other studies, actually, you can see that being more threatened doesn't mean that they're better covered by the literature. Also, the effectiveness, I'm not going to tell you too much about this, but it's worth keeping in mind that the effectiveness when we actually do expert assessments of the evidence that we collect is not always clear-cut. It doesn't mean that just because a conservation action exists and is implemented, it's beneficial. Some of them are not. A lot of them, actually, the evidence is basically unknown. And I'm briefly going to mention something about costs, because we do a lot of work on costs. I have a PhD student, Tom White, who's doing some fantastic work. And this, for me, actually was always a bit interesting, because whenever you discuss implementing actions with people working in economy, they always say, oh, what about the cost effectiveness? And we say, well, we don't really have cost data in conservation. And they always think it's very strange, right? But we don't. I think it's a problem that we should raise, actually, and there are solutions, I think. So we've done a global evidence review of cost inclusions in conservation literature, and as you can see, actually, while something like a third of all the studies mention costs, only about 8% of them report the costs, and only about 2% in a way that is actually usable. And you can see worse that the publication rate doesn't actually improve in terms of the inclusion of costs. Interestingly, there's higher reporting of costs in the global south for whatever reason, which we don't know. But in Africa and in South America, they are actually doing a better job than us, I suppose, in Europe or in North America or in Australia in terms of reporting costs. And you will be pleased to hear that for some types of interventions, the costs are better reported, and this includes actually infrastructure, invasive species control, and agri-environment. But costs, and this is something that I'm always keen to emphasize, are really complex. Your cost is not going to be my cost. And this is why actually presenting the cost in a way that is usable is what's important. If I say that for me it costs, I don't know, 10,000 pounds to put in ponds, that doesn't mean that for you it's going to be anything similar, because you might not have the equipment, you might not actually own the land, all these other elements. So we're working on a simple cost reporting framework, which hopefully will be published soon. But one of the elements actually that was very interesting was when we looked at the costs for specific actions, you can see that there's a huge amount of variability for the same costs, for the same actions in terms of the costs reported. And we don't really know why that might be. But it makes it particularly important to notify that and to work on that. So this is work that we're trying to publish now. Hopefully, I will make you interested in it. It's basically a standardized, simple cost reporting framework that we're really going to try and push with conservation practitioners, where we actually use it, how we can include the costs in a way that actually make them analyzable for others. So going back to conservation evidence and this project that I'm working on, hopefully you will have heard of it. If not, you're hearing about it today. If I do a quick search for roads, for instance, I have 234 actions, and you can see there the various actions with the effectiveness category, the number of studies, and also the type of synopsis. So these are, the first two are terrestrial mammals, then we have moths and butterflies and amphibians and others. And this is the last one. Well, actually, it's not. It's almost the last one that we published last year. This is reptile conservation. And just to give you an idea of what it means, a total of 293 journals were searched, over 700,000 articles, of which some 700 were actually included. And if I search for a single action, so for instance, from the reptile synopsis, if I look at installing barriers and crossing structures around roads, you can actually see it gives you a background. It gives you the global map of where those studies have been found and where they were carried out. Then you have the key messages. You can actually see in the last one, in behavior, 12 out of the 16 studies were on use. So keep in mind what I was saying before about use. And then for each of these studies, we present a highly standardized summary. So these are supposed to be written in plain English. It gives you study design, and it actually provides you the raw data. And finally, it also says you might want to check the other related actions. And we've done quite a lot of these. So birds actually is undertaking an update now, bats and terrestrial mammals and others. And this one was just published in May this year, butterfly and moth conservation. But keep in mind that not all literature is in English. And this is particularly important considering here we are at a conference in English. But when one of our colleagues, Tatsuya Amano, did this global review, he found that about a third of the conservation literature is not in English. It's in other languages. And we published a paper a couple of years ago where we look at this distribution of the studies. And as it turns out, the rate actually of publications in languages other than English is not declining. And very importantly, when we look at species covered by this non-English literature, we see that for some taxa, so you can see there it's amphibians, mammals, and birds, a certain number of those species in each of that taxa are not going to be covered at all if we exclude this non-English literature. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And we're trying to introduce that. So in terms of what next, we have this tool that we're developing. It's called dynamic meta-analysis. For now, actually, it's being applied to invasive species, but we hope that as time goes by, we can apply it more broadly. And I'd be very interested to discuss this with any of you who are interested. This was published last year as well. But ultimately, what this means is that we extract effect sizes from each of the studies that we summarize, and then it allows you to customize the meta-analysis for your case. So let's say that you're interested in control of Japanese knotweed, a particularly awful species, but you're only interested in doing that actually, I don't know, in Switzerland and in urban areas. Now, obviously, that greatly restricts for instance, the available pesticides that you might want to use. So this allows you actually to input your data and to rerun the meta-analysis with that context. And we've also published a paper with a whole bunch of practitioners from different organizations in terms of this evidence-based guidance. And this is something that I'm very, very, very keen on because I think it's a really nice way sort of going forward. So what this does is it says, look, guidance actually doesn't mean that we should only use evidence, because we all know that in a lot of cases the evidence is not there, right? We cannot not do stuff just because we don't have the data. But it means that we should proceed cautiously, right? The bad gantry actually was not a terrible idea conceptually, but because there was no data initially, people should have done it more carefully. And we have actually come up with a simple system where we say, look, the evidence is assessed, but the results are mixed. And then you should actually put that in wording. You should say, most evidence supports the idea that. These are simple, straightforward principles that I think actually can be implemented, and the data should be referenced clearly so that we could always trace it back to the primary literature and say, actually, this doesn't sound at all like my study, and therefore, maybe I should take it a bit more carefully. So in terms of conclusions and what we see are ways forward and cost-effectiveness solutions, there's evidence of action effectiveness databases, and IENI actually is extremely well placed to deliver on that because they're already doing such fantastic work, or we are doing such fantastic work, I suppose, the broader community. We need practitioner experiences databases, ultimately somewhere where practitioners have implemented stuff and they say, right, this is how it worked or how it didn't work. Comprehensive decision support processes, ideally pre-registration of projects. This is something that nobody does in conservation, but it's actually a standard thing in medicine. The simple thing being that actually we all know that if we implement something and it doesn't work, we tend not to publish it. But because we tend not to publish it, we don't learn from it, right? And we're saying that with pre-registration, actually, it becomes much simpler for people to say, we've done it, it didn't work, there's no shame. You know, let's move on from that. Standard cost databases, standard taxonomy of actions, as we heard before, there are problems with definitions and with using the same terms to mean different things, and standards for evidence-based guidance. And I'm going to finish with this to say that our group actually has this really big book that is coming out, I think, in November, called Transforming Conservation, and it's going to be free to download as an ebook. So, thank you very much to our funders. Hopefully there's various ideas for all of you, and I'll be very happy to discuss with you. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Silviu. It was really an impressive presentation, and I'm really keen to read all those articles that you recommended. Questions? Okay, cool. Cool as the room.
Hello. Hello. Margrit Trockme from Switzerland. The costs, that's a very interesting point. One of the first fauna passages we built in Switzerland, which was very large, there were no standards at that time in the early 1990s. And I asked the engineer responsible, well, how much did it cost? And he could not say, because most of the earthwork was material from a tunnel that, had he not used it for the fauna passage, he would have had to very costly deposit it somewhere. So that, and I think we are always confronted with that, is that the question is, if you don't do that, what would it have cost not to do it? It's almost easier to answer it that way, because things are so much integrated.
Just to briefly say, I entirely agree. And we actually have quite a few examples of almost exactly the same thing happening. The problem is that inherently, depending on the actor, the costs are going to be different as well. So we're saying there's a simple framework that hopefully people can use so that we can report the costs in a way that actually ultimately allows practitioners to compare actions, not just in terms of effectiveness, but also in terms of cost effectiveness.
Thank you very much. Yannick?
Say that in France, we started our first systematic review 8 years ago on infrastructure and biodiversity. And clearly this was a very strong tool for us to know that we need to reinforce the robustness of research, because we realized that most of the research that we funded were more closer to studies than from research, and database and methodology were almost lacking or not developed enough to be considered as robust enough to be integrated for meta-analysis, for going a step beyond. But really this tool now is also a driver for us for inviting us, when we are funding research, to be very attentive to the quality process of research, to reinforce it, to ensure that what will be funded will not be only one-step study. We need also to use it in a longer term, and such actions with this process is really fundamental if we want to use it in a longer term. So I strongly encourage all funders of research to work in that way, to reinforce the quality process of their research, and not only to have studies, because studies cannot be reused and cannot be reusable in other cases than in what they are funded in the first. So, thank you.
Fantastic to hear that. One thing that I'm going to say in relation to that is, for instance, when you look at bat boxes, I think you all know bat boxes, right? They're everywhere in Britain, and you see them in lots of mitigation cases. when you look at the evidence that we have, it's something like, I think, 46 studies that we have in conservation evidence that all look at usage. And you think, okay, fine, we know that bats use them, but can we actually look at what this means? You know, just because bats use them doesn't actually inherently translate in a benefit for conservation. They might use them and they might actually be neutral, or they might even be detrimental. Keep in mind that actually with bird boxes, there were examples, for instance, in Spain, where the nests that were provided for lesser kestrel, which actually worked otherwise very well, were becoming too hot in some of the summers for lesser kestrels, and the chicks actually were jumping out from those nest boxes. So it is actually important to look at usage, but let's move on, as you say, and let's look at what this means and improve the quality of the studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The last question, please.
Okay. Congratulations. Thank you very much for this impressive talk. And we are users of conservation evidence, and I encourage everybody to use it. So great. I have a question to you about there is a lot of I don't know if we call it evidence, but when we are working trying to provide guidelines to practitioners, a part comes from the published papers. Yeah, we have included a rationale box, as you know, in the review. But then a lot of information is coming from practitioners about materials that are working, about fences that are trapping animals, perhaps. There is no published research about this. So how can we deal with?
I totally agree. One thing I would say is that perhaps this is something that INI could do. I think the organization is ideally placed to create this database of implementation where you're saying, look, for a specific action, can we look at what implementation advice we might have? And I would really strongly separate that from expert advice. What expert advice often means is people actually that haven't really done it, but they have an opinion of whether or not it might work. And that's very different. I won't even discuss that. But implementation advice, I really think that INI actually could and should capture that information in a simple, standardized way. Have you done this? How did it work? Were your fences leaking or whatever? Were the animals getting caught in, I don't know, something? Some information that actually is difficult, I think, to publish in a paper, but is very easy to capture in a database.
Okay, thank you very much, Silviu. And we have one kind request from the chat. If you can post maybe the link of your book, of your new book, so that everybody can have access and buy it and so on. Is the conference platform, Converia, or if you give us the link, we will post it to everybody. Thank you very much.